Today, we're taking a brief look at one of the most important training aircraft ever made. For decades, it was the pride of the Czechoslovakian aircraft industry. And no, I'm not talking about the L-39 Albatros, I'm talking about its predecessor. You see, at the height of the Cold War, the pilots of the Soviet Air Force, and many other Eastern Bloc nations, owed much of their training, and sometimes the preservation of their lives, to one machine. And that was the Aero L-29. Hello and welcome back. My name is Christopher Rex Elmden. I like to talk about planes a lot, and today is the first video where I'm actually talking about a jet aircraft that entered production and was actually useful. It's only taken me nearly 5 years to get this far, but you know, your patience is finally being rewarded, okay? And I'm sorry to disappoint a lot of you, today's video is not on something like the F-86 Sabre, the P-80 Shooting Star, the MiG-15, what have you. It is on a training aircraft, and that is because I firmly believe the L-29 is wholly underappreciated for what it contributed to the training of pilots in Eastern Bloc nations in the Cold War. It is basically responsible for the pilot training of most of the major frontline pilots that you would see in the 60s, 70s, and even to a degree going into the 1980s. This video also marks the first time where I'm testing out a new audio setup using a lav mic instead of my high sensitivity studio mic, just to see if I can get a better balance between audio quality and also not keeping a giant microphone in shot. So we'll see how this sounds. You know, let me know in the comments if you think this audio is okay, or if you want me to go back to the higher quality studio mic. Anyway, let's actually talk about the L-29, shall we? The L-29 was developed during a time when a lot of the world's air forces needed to upgrade their training fleets, chief among them being the Soviet Union. By the mid-1950s, a critical gap had emerged in pilot training. Student pilots were often learning on low-performance piston-engine aircraft like the Yak-18, but they were then required to transition directly onto high-performance training versions of frontline fighters like the MiG-15 UTI. This was understandably very dangerous. The performance and handling characteristics of the two types were simply far too different for it to be a safe progression, and fatal training accidents were not uncommon. There was a desperate need for a dedicated jet trainer that could handle something known as all-through training. This would take pilots from their first flights all the way through to intermediate levels of training, which include weapons familiarization. They would then be able to more safely transition into final training into whichever aircraft that they would be operating in their frontline combat units. The Soviet Air Force eventually wrote up such a requirement for this training aircraft in the mid to late 1950s. Over time, this requirement was progressively expanded towards the goal of developing a jet trainer that could be easily adopted across the various national air forces that made up the Eastern Bloc. Now, during this time, the Czechoslovakian Air Force had also been developing their own requirements for an all-through jet trainer. This led to a private venture with engineers working with the Czechoslovak Aviation Research Testing Institute, VZLU, and the manufacturer Aero L-29. Zdeněk and Karel Tomáš were the original designers behind what would become the L-29, but they would retire before its completion, and the design and development of the L-29 would be finalized by another engineer by the name of Jan Vlček. Their design philosophy prioritized simplicity, ruggedness, and ease of control. Their goal wasn't just to produce a safe aircraft that was easy to fly, but also one that would be easy to manufacture in large numbers economically. The result of their efforts was the prototype XL-29. Completed in the spring of 1959, it immediately showed all the hallmarks of a promising jet trainer. The mid-mounted main wings were unswept. This was to improve stability, but also to make them easier to mass produce. It also had the added benefits of allowing the air intakes to be installed in the wing roots that would feed the centrally mounted engine in the rear of the fuselage. Ease of control was a major priority, as loss of control accidents was often the #1 cause of fatalities among young pilots training up in various air forces. Slotted flaps were used for both takeoff and landing, the ailerons used aerodynamic compensation to reduce roll forces, and the landing gear was reinforced to absorb the hard, unsteady, and sometimes panicked landings of various inexperienced pilots. But the standout aerodynamic feature of the L-29 is its T-shaped tail, which, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is unique among mass-produced and dedicated jet training aircraft. By keeping the horizontal tail surfaces in clean air high above the wake generated by the wings, it makes the elevator far more effective. During a spin, it also prevents the elevator from shadowing or blocking the airflow going over the rudder, which makes spin recovery far easier. T-tails, of course, have their own drawbacks over a more conventional tail layout. They can be a bit more difficult to maintain and service, but more importantly than that, they do have a major aerodynamic drawback. At high angles of attack at high speed, the main wings can block the airflow going over the tail, which can lead to a deep and dangerous stall. This is something you don't really encounter with conventional tail layouts, which is why you'll see a lot of very highly maneuverable aircraft not featuring this particular layout of tail design. However, the L-29 would need to be pushed far beyond its intended performance envelope for this to be a risk, and because of that, the T-tail was kept. Ease of maintenance was of course another major priority when they were designing the L-29, and because of that, the airframe was covered with panels that could be easily removed to access critical internal components. On top of this, the fuselage was designed to split in half behind the wing, allowing the rear section to be rolled away on a special trolley for the engine to be able to be easily accessed. This was a feature that was inspired and borrowed by the training version of the MiG-15 then in Soviet service. Now, speaking of the engine, the Czechoslovak Air Force was reluctant, shall we say, to rely on Soviet license-built turbojets for a number of reasons, and they had invited the engine manufacturer Motolet to produce a domestic alternative. This resulted in the Motolet M701, which was designed specifically with this new jet training aircraft in mind. This was a single-stage centrifugal flow turbojet, generating a maximum thrust of approximately 1,900 pounds. It ran successfully for the first time in 1958, but it was still expected to be in testing when the first prototype aircraft was due to be completed. To avoid delays, therefore, the XL-29 was completed with a different turbojet, the Bristol Siddeley Viper, and it made its first flight with this engine on the 5th of April 1959. The next prototype, not counting a static test airframe that was built as the second, also carried the Viper engine, but in July of 1960, the Motolet engine powered the third flying prototype successfully. With this, Czechoslovakia had finally freed itself from relying on foreign-built turbojets, and from that point on, it became the exclusive power plant for the Aero L-29. It was also around this time that the L-29 finally received its nickname of Delfin, or Dolphin, which soon became its official moniker. And when you look at it from certain photographic angles, it's really easy to see why they picked this name. The front end of it really does look like the head of a dolphin. With its intended engine now installed, the L-29 would go through a period of accelerated testing. This was because the Soviet Union had announced a competition that would select the next generation of military training aircraft for the entire Eastern Bloc, and Aero had been invited to submit their promising prototype for consideration. On the whole, the flight tests went smoothly, but they did result in some minor changes. Perforation holes were added to the air brakes, which had a nasty habit of causing severe vibrations when deployed, which was not ideal, and the pitot tube was relocated from the tail to the wing. This was because it was giving incorrect readings during sharp aerial maneuvers. In 1961, after completion of its initial testing, the third flying prototype was flown over to Moscow. There, it would enter into a grueling 2-month evaluation against 2 other competing prototypes for the new Eastern Bloc jet trainer. These were the Soviet-built Yakubovich Yak-30 and the Polish-built PZL TS-11 Iskra. These trials were sophisticated and exhaustive, overseen by a commission with representatives from all 3 of the participating nations and headed by Soviet Lieutenant General Matveyev. The aircraft were evaluated for their performance, handling qualities, technical complexity, ease of tactical readiness, ergonomics, ease of maintenance, the time required for engine replacement, ruggedness, rough field operations capacity. The list went on and on. The whole thing was treated very seriously. Indeed, the competition put the prototypes under more scrutiny than the evaluations of the supersonic MiG-21 fighter. This was, after all, going to determine the future of aerial training for most of the Eastern Bloc's fighter pilots. It was a big deal. At the conclusion of the trials, the Yak-30 was quickly eliminated from consideration. It was built more like a racer rather than a trainer, and it didn't offer the balanced or forgiving handling qualities that were required. That left the Aero L-29 and the PZL TS-11. Now, depending on what sources you read, each aircraft is claimed to have outperformed the other, which, of course, is impossible. In truth, both had their merits, and both met all the requirements to which they had been built. But after due consideration, it was the L-29 that was selected as the overall winner. This was on the grounds that it was considered to be more reliable, durable, and easier to maintain, along with having superior handling on rough and unpaved runways. In terms of performance, it also had lower stall and landing speeds, and it required a shorter length of runway for takeoff, all of which were very valuable qualities for a trainer to have. But all of that being said though, the true reason for its selection was most likely political. The decision was heavily influenced by the goal of integrating the various aviation industries of member nations of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, also known as Comecon. To prevent the Czechoslovakian aircraft industry from stagnating, it had already been decided that Czech factories would be given the responsibility of producing the new training aircraft regardless of who won. Thus, selecting the L-29 not only ensured that production lines in Czechoslovakia would remain active for years to come, but it also meant that production could start pretty much immediately, as the Aero factory had already tooled up for the purpose of building this airframe. The Poles did not take this decision well. Despite the Commission's clear recommendation for the L-29, the Polish government rejected the results and chose to proceed with the TS-11 Iskra for its own air force, both to save costs and to continue developing its domestic aviation industry. However, all the other Warsaw Pact nations would follow the recommendation, and they would soon adopt the L-29 as their primary trainer. The result would be the largest aircraft production plan to take place in any Comecon nation outside the Soviet Union. During its 11-year production run, a total of over 3,660 L-29 trainers would eventually be produced. It also resulted in a major production program for the Motolet 701 turbojet. Over 9,000 would eventually be produced, with at least 5,000 being delivered purely in support of L-29 production and servicing. To this day, the L-29 is still the most produced dedicated military jet trainer in the world. The only other trainer that was built in more numbers was the Lockheed T-33, but that was a conversion of the F-80 Shooting Star and not designed as a dedicated trainer from the outset. The L-29 was produced across 42 production batches, or series, eventually incorporating over 45 modifications and changes. Beyond serving the Warsaw Pact, the Delfin was exported widely, serving with countries including Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Uganda. In terms of overall production, the majority of the aircrafts built would be of the standard L-29 configuration, but there were a few exceptions. The L-29A, standing for Acrobat, was a pet project by some of the more enthusiastic engineers at Aero who wanted to see just how far the airframe could be pushed. Only 2 of these would be built, one converted from the third prototype and then one dedicated airframe. They would spend their time participating in various international engineering fairs and wowing Western audiences at the 1969 Paris Air Show. The only true subvariant of the L-29 would be the L-29R. It was developed as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft intended for operations near front lines. Its primary modification involved the installation of a container which would hold photo reconnaissance equipment and multiple downward-facing cameras, and this would be installed in the location where the rear cockpit usually was. Now, while some records indicate that the project to develop this was terminated in 1965, other sources state that it was produced in a small series, specifically within the 18th production batch of the L-29. This is supported by Czech documentation, and there is strong evidence as well that a batch was exported to Egypt. In general, the L-29 saw an incredibly long and active service life. The Soviet Air Force was the largest operator, receiving approximately 2,000 units to replace their aging fleet of trainers, as well as the training variants of the MiG-15. The perception of the aircraft by those who flew it was overwhelmingly positive. Soviet pilots and instructors famously used car analogies to describe its quality. They compared the smooth handling of the Delfin to a Volga automobile, while older planes like the Yak-18 were likened to a primitive Moskvich, and the MiG-15 to something called a Pobeda. I think that's how I pronounce it anyway. Soviet instructors especially praised the aircraft for its handling. It was described as being both forgiving and docile, and it was capable of tolerating many student errors that would have been fatal in less stable airframes. This sentiment is reflected elsewhere as well. In Czechoslovakian service, the aircraft was affectionately known as the Flying Pram, because of the comfort and security that it offered instructors as their babies made their first tentative ventures into the sky. According to them, a cadet could be ready for a first solo flight after around 13 hours with an instructor. It was not a machine designed to impress experienced pilots, but it was apparently very good at preventing the inexperienced ones from killing themselves, which was perhaps the most useful quality you would want to find in a trainer. Now, as it often happens, as the type matured, its role was sometimes expanded from training to direct combat operations, and this had mixed results. Egyptian L-29s were used for strike missions against Israeli ground forces during the Yom Kippur War, and the type saw active service during the Nigerian Civil War. However, its combat limitations became clear during the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, where Azeri forces would lose some 14 out of 18 aircraft to Armenian anti-aircraft fire. The trainer's slow speed and lack of any real armor protection made it highly vulnerable in high-threat environments, and it was only ever really used successfully in combat in situations where it was able to enjoy the protection of aerial superiority. By the early 1970s, the L-29 was already being succeeded by Aero's more capable L-39 Albatros. Nevertheless, the Delfin remained in military service with some operators for decades, often flying alongside its replacement. Some were still registered as active military aircraft at the beginning of the 2020s. Following the end of the Cold War, large numbers of surviving L-29s would fall into private ownership. There, the same qualities that had made it appealing to military flying schools — simple handling, sturdy construction, and straightforward maintenance — made it a popular civilian jet and an air racing aircraft. Today, the L-29 is still flying, at air shows, the occasional flight school, and even for research purposes. In 2007, an unmodified L-29 made history by completing the world's first jet flight powered solely by biodiesel. And 3 other aircraft are still in active use with American universities, mostly for high-dynamic flight research. And that is 65 years after the type first entered service. That is a fantastic testament to a well-designed airframe.